The Turner home was a peaceful retreat at the end of a tree-lined suburban street. John, a businessman, and his wife, Emily, an elementary school teacher, had decided to move to the picturesque neighborhood in search of a quieter life to raise their two children, Ethan and Lily. The two-story house was a typical suburban residence, with large windows and a small, well-kept front yard. It was a charming and inviting place, perfect for families who wanted to escape the frenetic pace of the city. On the rainy afternoon they arrived, the neighborhood seemed to be exactly what the Turners expected. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the birds sang happily. John parked the car in the driveway, while Emily and the children excitedly looked at their new home. As they unpacked, a soft knock on the door caught Emily's attention. She dried her wet hands on her apron and hurried to answer. When she opened the door, she was greeted by a middle-aged man with gray hair, wearing a wool sweater. "Hello, I'm your neighbor, Mr. Anderson," he said with a gentle smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood. If you need anything, I'm right next door." Emily thanked her new neighbor for his kindness and invited him inside. Mr. Anderson refused, saying he didn't want to get in the way, but promised he would be there to help if they needed anything. In the days that followed, the Turner family settled into their new home. The neighborhood proved to be even more welcoming than they expected. The children made new friends at the local school, and John began to form bonds with other parents. Mr. Anderson was a helpful neighbor from day one. He brought homemade cakes and cookies and offered to help assemble furniture and fix minor problems around the house. His kindness did not go unnoticed by the Turners, who began to consider him part of their new extended family. Over time, family meals and birthday parties always included Mr. Anderson's presence. He was willing to help with anything, from taking care of the children to mowing the lawn. It was clear he valued his friendship with the Turners. Emily felt relieved to have such a trustworthy neighbor next door. She, John, and the children, Ethan and Lily, had left busy city life in search of a warm, welcoming community. It seemed they had found just that in their new neighbor. However, the tranquility that the Turners had found in that neighborhood was about to be shattered. In the silence of the night, when everyone should have been sleeping, strange things began to occur. Mysterious sounds echoed through the house, disturbing the family's sleep and triggering a series of frightening events that would change their lives forever. The first strange sounds came like a whisper in the dark. Emily woke up in the middle of the night to a creaking sound coming from downstairs. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, trying to discern what could have caused the noise. She assumed it was the normal sounds of an old house. However, subsequent nights brought more than squeaks. The sounds became more distinct, sounding like hammering and the dragging of heavy furniture. The echo of the night's activities filled the house with an unsettling aura. One night, Emily woke up to the sound of what sounded like footsteps shuffling down the hallway. She tensed, listening intently. The steps were slow and deliberate, as if someone were walking through the house. Cautiously, she woke John. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her gaze concerned. John frowned and heard the footsteps. They were unmistakable. Someone was in their house. Carefully, they left the room and inspected the house. There was no sign of intruders, but the children, Ethan and Lily, were awake and looked scared. The Turners chalked the incident up to frightened imaginations and went back to bed. But the feeling of restlessness persisted. The next few days brought more strange events. Emily noticed that Ethan and Lily's toys seemed to move mysteriously during the night. Dolls that had been left on the floor overnight appeared piled on the dresser in the morning. Emily and John didn't know what to think and began to consider the possibility that someone was secretly entering their home. Then one night, as Emily sat in the dark with a worried look on her face, she saw something that made her freeze. A dark figure moved down the hallway towards the children's room. Emily screamed John's name and ran to the children's room. It was too late. The shadowy figure disappeared into the children's room, and the door closed with a bang, locking itself. Emily and John desperately tried to open the door, but it was locked. They heard Ethan and Lily crying on the other side of the door, followed by a sigh of relief. They finally managed to open the door, but the room was empty. The Turners knew something was terribly wrong. Someone, or something, was disturbing the peace of your home at night. They felt helpless and vulnerable. Desperate, Emily and John talked about what to do next. They had no concrete evidence that someone was breaking into their home, and the night's events seemed increasingly inexplicable. They decided it was time to confront their neighbor, Mr. Anderson, and find out if he knew anything about what was going on. The morning after the locked door incident in the children's room, Emily and John Turner decided it was time to confront their neighbor, Mr. Anderson. They felt they had no option but to broach the matter directly with him, as the night's events seemed to be related to their proximity. Emily and John knocked on Mr. Anderson's door that sunny afternoon. The elderly man greeted them with his usual friendly smile, but Emily noticed that his eyes seemed restless. She tried to be direct but delicate when addressing the subject. "Mr. Anderson, we've been noticing some strange events happening at night around our house," Emily began. "Sounds, things moving, and even the feeling that someone has entered our house. Have you noticed anything similar?" Mr. Anderson seemed surprised by the question and shook his head. "Oh no, I haven't heard anything unusual, Emily. I'm sorry you guys are going through this, but I'm sure it's just your imagination." John, worried, decided to follow the neighbor to his house to check inside. He wanted to make sure that Mr. Anderson wasn't hiding anything. The elderly man seemed reluctant, but eventually allowed John to enter. The interior of Mr. Anderson's house was gloomy, with heavy curtains blocking out natural light. It looked like a house frozen in time, filled with antiques and old photographs on the walls. The photos showed unfamiliar faces, people John had never seen in the neighborhood. John examined the house carefully while Mr. Anderson watched him with a penetrating gaze. There was no evidence that the elderly man was involved in the disturbing events taking place at the Turner home. But something disturbed him. Mr. Anderson's house had an air of mystery that was hard to ignore. Emily and John left Mr. Anderson's house without clear answers. They had no hard evidence, just a feeling of growing uneasiness. They didn't want to believe that their friendly neighbor could be involved in the night's events, but something wasn't right. That night, as Emily and John lay in bed, they continued to discuss what to do next. They weren't sure if they could trust Mr. Anderson, but they didn't have enough evidence to charge him with anything. Emily decided the only option was to keep a closer eye on her neighbor and continue monitoring disturbing events. As the night wore on, the sounds of the night continued to echo through the Turner home. It was as if something invisible was moving through the house, disturbing the family's sleep. Emily and John were beginning to feel like prisoners in their own home, unable to escape the inexplicable events that tormented them. The Turners had no idea that the truth about Mr. Anderson and the disturbing events taking place in that neighborhood were about to be revealed. The mystery surrounding them was becoming increasingly frightening, and they wondered if they could solve the riddles before it was too late. The Turners spent restless nights, with nighttime sounds persisting and strange events continuing to happen. They sensed that something sinister was occurring in their neighborhood, but had no concrete evidence to support their suspicions. Emily, John, Ethan, and Lily were starting to feel like hostages in their own home. While the family was on the verge of despair, a new clue emerged. Emily found an old diary in a drawer in the living room. It was an accidental discovery, but the contents of the diary were disturbing. The diary belonged to a former resident of the house, a man named Charles. Charles's notes revealed that he too had experienced the inexplicable events the Turners were facing. He wrote about nighttime sounds, objects moving on their own, and a shadowy figure he believed was haunting his home. As Emily read the journal aloud to her family, one name stood out, Mr. Anderson. Charles mentioned approaching his neighbor for help and guidance, but instead Mr. Anderson had become increasingly obsessed with the unexplained phenomena. Charles' diary ended abruptly with a final note. "He wants me to join them." The Turners were shocked by the diary's revelation. It seemed that the connection between Mr. Anderson and the disturbing events went beyond what they had imagined. Charles seemed to have solved part of the mystery before disappearing, but what he meant by joining them was a puzzle. Determined to get answers, the Turners decided to confront Mr. Anderson again. This time, they would approach him with the information they had discovered in Charles' diary. They had to find out what was happening in that neighborhood and protect the family from increasingly terrifying events. That afternoon, the Turners went to Mr. Anderson's house, where he greeted them with his usual smile. But as they shared what they had discovered in Charles' diary, the elderly man's smile faded. His eyes showed signs of uneasiness and fear. "What do you know about this?" asked John, his voice thick with tension. Mr. Anderson sighed deeply and finally began to speak. He confessed that he had witnessed the disturbing events for years, but did not know how to stop them. He said something supernatural was happening in that neighborhood, something he couldn't understand. When Emily mentioned the final note in Charles' diary, "He wants me to join them," Mr. Anderson revealed the most disturbing secret of all. He said that the night's events were caused by something supernatural that was drawing tormented souls to a parallel dimension, a dimension where all nightmares came true. Mr. Anderson believed that he himself was being manipulated by this sinister entity, and that he was just a pawn in a macabre game. He feared the same thing could happen to the Turners, especially the children, if they didn't take drastic action. The Turners were stunned by the revelation. They had entered a situation that was beyond their understanding and control. The only option was to find a way to break the cycle of supernatural events and stop their lives from being dragged into darkness. With Mr. Anderson's help, the Turners began searching for answers and solutions. They delved into research into the occult, looking for clues that would help them understand and defeat the supernatural entity that threatened their lives. The mystery was far from solved, but the Turners were determined to face the unknown and protect their family. The battle against the supernatural was about to intensify, and they knew the outcome could be the difference between light and dark.